How do vast realms rise from scattered towns and then crumble into memory? The answer is never a single battle. The pattern begins with energy that can be directed, whether it is river grain or steppe pasture or ocean wind. When leaders turn that energy into organization and a story people accept, borders move outward and a state becomes an empire. People follow because the system promises safety and a path to status as long as taxes are paid and rules are clear. At their height, empires discover that logistics are more decisive than spectacle. Roads and relays matter more than brave charges. Shared law and fair tax matter more than one great ruler. Stability is not accident but habit. When soldiers are paid on time and grain moves along predictable routes, a province begins to feel like home rather than conquest. That feeling builds consent and keeps the center from constantly sending force to every edge. Collapse rarely looks like a single cliff. It feels like a slow leak that suddenly rips open. Costs grow at the margins. Factions at court fight over succession. A drought or plague turns stress into crisis. When the story of rule is no longer believed, the same roads that once moved tax and orders now carry deserters and doubt. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more 4K history documentaries. We greatly appreciate your support. What makes an empire? An empire is more than a big kingdom. It is rule across many peoples and many landscapes under one supreme authority that extracts resources from faraway lands and redistributes those resources to secure loyalty. That definition separates an empire from a simple monarchy. Multi-ethnic administration is the crucial marker because it forces the center to weave different laws, languages, and elites into one workable system. Without that bridgework, conquest stays fragile and the map shrinks as quickly as it grows. Measurement gives clarity. Rise is the period when expansion becomes self-funding because new territories deliver more revenue than they cost to hold. Peak is when the imperial core pays for peace as effectively as it pays for war, which means tax intake is steady, roads are safe, and elites cooperate because cooperation is rewarding. Collapse begins when costs grow faster than revenue and when succession becomes uncertain enough to scare soldiers and financiers. Predictable paydays keep spears loyal, while doubt cuts the payline at its root. Institutions convert conquest into consent. Satrapies, provinces, and client kingdoms let distant communities keep habits while sending tribute and hostages that bind them to the center. Legal universals such as citizenship ladders or protected status for faith communities create room for ambition and dignity inside the imperial frame. This is why talented locals often choose to serve the center. Service is safer than rebellion when a future is clearly offered. Logistics is the hidden monarch behind the throne. Relay posts, caravanserai, canals, fortified ports, and later railways decide whether a victory becomes a durable frontier or a line on a map that will be erased next spring. A strong empire monetizes movement so that each mile of road multiplies value rather than draining the treasury. The longer that multiplication holds, the more resilient the structure becomes. A story completes the machine. Universal law, the mandate of heaven, the guardianship of the faith, the civilizing mission, or the promise of prosperity gives people a reason to accept a distant center. Stories are not decoration. They are part of the budget because they lower the cost of rule. When belief fades, costs rise, and when costs rise too far, the center cannot keep its promises. That is when the imperial clock begins to wind down. 1550 BC Egypt New Kingdom. Egypt's new kingdom did not begin with a blank slate. It rose from a native revival that expelled foreign rulers and then pushed outward with new confidence. The Nile's dependable floods gave a surplus that could be taxed without killing the fields. That surplus paid for chariots, fortified towns, and river fleets that linked Upper and Lower Egypt with precision. A warrior court centered on the pharaoh turned wealth into power and power into predictable ritual that told every village who was in charge and why. The rise carried Egypt north into the Levant and south into Nubia. Military campaigns created zones of influence, while garrisons and way stations kept the chains strong. Tribute from timbered hills and gold-rich valleys flowed toward the Nile heartland, and artisans turned that flow into temples and tombs that advertised stability. The message was simple: order lives here, and the gods approve. Farmers could plant with less fear, and merchants could move with fewer bribes. That security made loyalty feel profitable. Peak power in Egypt meant more than conquest. Administration widened. Scribes counted everything, from cattle to copper. Marriages linked the royal house to neighbors, trading spears for dowries. Foreign princes sent gifts to Thebes because it was smart to be seen as a friend. Diplomacy worked because strength was believable, and strength was believable because the tax machine did not stutter. When granaries were full and river travel was safe, the center did not have to shout to be heard. The new kingdom cracked under intersecting pressures rather than a single blow. Sea raiders disturbed trade routes. Local elites accumulated influence in temple estates. Court factions argued over direction and inheritance. Each problem fed the others. When revenue dipped, the court could not reward all claimants. When soldiers felt uncertainty, border posts lost nerve. The Nile still rose and fell, but the political tide no longer kept rhythm. Egypt's lesson is that even the most fertile core cannot hold an empire if the periphery becomes too costly and the court becomes divided. Surplus without unity is a feast with too many claimants. A river can grow food, but it cannot referee fights in the palace. Empires do not fall only when enemies cross a border. They fall when the people inside the walls stop believing that tomorrow will look like today. 700 BC Assyrian Empire. Assyria built the first fully professional war machine in the Near East and turned it into a state that reached from the mountains of the north to the Nile frontier. Iron weapons, trained infantry, siege engines, and swift cavalry gave Assyrian armies an edge that neighbors dreaded. Conquest fed the capital cities with tribute, while roads stitched conquered capitals to Nineveh and Nimrud. Messages moved quickly because the state invested in speed, and fear worked as policy because resistance looked expensive. Administrators followed the armies and made conquest feel permanent. Deportations relocated skilled workers to places where they could be watched and taxed. Vassal kings kept their thrones if they paid and behaved. Provincial governors sent reports that told the center where to station troops and where to squeeze less. The system relied on precision and terror in tandem. The result was growth that felt unstoppable until the machine outpaced its own repairs. At its height, Assyria was more network than nation. Trade routes were secured by force of reputation, and the court accumulated luxuries that confirmed prestige at home. The royal inscriptions speak of order imposed upon chaos, a story that justified heavy taxation because protection was visible. This arrangement delivered stability as long as the army remained undefeated and the flow of tribute stayed wide enough to make fear profitable. Decline arrived when coalitions formed, when distant provinces consumed more soldiers than they produced in revenue, and when leadership made miscalculations under pressure. Great powers on the periphery learned to synchronize their strikes. Internal revolts drained the reserve that once guaranteed victory. Cities that had seemed immortal suddenly became targets rather than fortresses. The fall was swift because the system left little room for forgiveness once cracks appeared. Assyria's legacy is a blueprint for both rapid rise and rapid collapse. Professional force can build an empire faster than rivals can copy it, but fear-based rule must be balanced by a path to inclusion. Without such a path, the center exhausts itself, punishing the edges. When all tools are hammers, every problem becomes a nail, and eventually the board splits. 500 BC, Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Persians built an empire that proved inclusion can be a weapon. Satrapies allowed regional customs to survive while still serving the great king. The royal road and its relay posts turned a daunting landscape into a manageable map. Couriers could cross the realm quickly, which meant the center could react to trouble before trouble gathered allies. This was logistics as quiet power, and it mattered more than any one victory. Persian rule made room for many gods and many languages under a single political story. As long as tribute arrived and rebellion stayed rare, local elites were confirmed in their roles and sometimes raised to higher posts. That bargain made the empire feel less like occupation and more like a ladder. People who might have fought the center found it wiser to join and profit. This lowered the cost of keeping the peace. Peak strength under the early kings was visible in paved highways, monumental capitals, and a treasury that could hire talent from across continents. The empire's reach to the edges of the known world demonstrated a statecraft that preferred regular revenue over plunder. Measured taxation built predictability, and predictability is the quiet secret of prosperity because merchants trust schedules more than promises. Fragility hid in succession and in the challenge of maintaining unity across vast distances. A charismatic conqueror can create a realm quickly, but needs an orderly process to hand power to the next ruler without a knife fight. When a rival of uncommon speed and ambition appeared in the West, the Persian system met a foe who turned speed into shock. When speed meets distance, distance often loses. Persia's pattern teaches that tolerance plus organization can hold astonishing variety together, but no system is safe without a clear rule for who sits on the throne next. Empires that make subjects into stakeholders endure longer. Empires that confuse loyalty with flattery meet a wall when a quick enemy tests their reflexes. 440 BC Classical Greek empires. Greece produced empires of a different flavor. Athens built a maritime order that turned allies into tribute payers, funding fleets that controlled sea lanes. Sparta enforced a land hegemony rooted in discipline and fear of revolt at home. Both models rose from particular strengths. The Athenian model harnessed money and ships. The Spartan model relied on training and the prestige of unbeatable infantry. Each story inspired supporters and stirred enemies. The Athenian rise showed how finance can become a weapon. Tribute from league members paid rowers and shipwrights and many hands in the port. Naval dominance let Athens move grain and ideas along the sea with minimal interference. Cultural glow added soft power. City festivals and public buildings told allies that the Athenian way promised beauty and order along with security. This blend made compliance feel desirable until costs became too sharp. Sparta used simplicity to project inevitability. The message was not prosperity, but certainty. A Spartan-led army would not break and would not tolerate disobedience. Allies valued that certainty during times of threat because predictability can be more comforting than wealth when danger looms. Yet that same rigidity made adaptation slow when conditions changed. A system built for one kind of war struggled to adjust to others. Both hegemonies cracked under coalition fatigue. Allies who felt squeezed searched for exits. War turned long and grinding, and the balance tilted back and forth until resources drained and patience thinned. Athens lost fleets and credibility. Sparta won, and then faced problems it was not designed to manage. A hegemony born from a city's unique habits can rule a region for a while, but it finds limits when it must become a universal administrator rather than a leading partner. The Greek lesson is that maritime and land-centered power each have advantages, yet both must solve the same problem of consent. Tribute that funds defense is tolerable until it funds extravagance. Allies remain loyal when they see their own future in the leader's success. When they stop seeing that future, their spears point home. 332 BC Macedonian Alexandrian Empire. Macedon fused horse, pike, and siegecraft into a storm that overtook old powers with surprising speed. A young king turned innovation into momentum, and momentum into legend. Combined arms, relentless marching, and flexible command tore gaps in older armies that were not prepared for such tempo. The empire expanded not step by step, but leap by leap, and those leaps stunned the world. Speed alone does not hold a conquest, so Macedon and then the Alexandrian administration used local elites to build continuity. Founding cities at strategic points created hubs of loyalty and trade. Veterans settled with land grants. Respect for certain local traditions kept doorways open. A conqueror who had shattered front lines invited scholars and craftsmen into his orbit and made his court a magnet. That magnetism spread a new culture without burning the old to ash. At its peak, the Alexandrian order was a network of garrisons and newly founded cities connected by roads and rivers. The treasury drew resources from many climates and turned them into pay and provisions with mechanical regularity. The blend of Greek language with local customs produced a cosmopolitan zone that merchants and thinkers found exciting. Confidence grew because the system looked like the future rather than an interruption. The engine faltered because succession had no clear rule. When the unmatched leader died without a simple plan for inheritance, lieutenants turned into rivals. An empire built at extraordinary speed cracked into pieces because no single institution was strong enough to bind it without the founder. Armies that had learned to cooperate on campaign learned to compete for capitals and crowns. The map kept many of the new cities, but the unity vanished. The Macedonian lesson is that military revolution can create a new political landscape almost overnight, yet durable order requires a method to pass power that does not depend on charisma. When a system cannot replace its head without crisis, it will eventually face a crisis it cannot survive. The cities endure, the roads remain useful, and the cultural blend outlives the crown. 250 BC Hellenistic successors. The successor kingdoms turned improvisation into policy. Seleucid rulers governed long corridors of land that demanded constant movement, while Ptolemaic rulers governed a compact river system that demanded constant accounting. Both understood that stability required more than soldiers. It required storage, scribes, and predictable procedures, so they invested in temples and treasuries as much as in walls. Statecraft grew sophisticated. Royal courts became centers of science and culture because knowledge projects legitimize rule. Calendars were standardized, weights and measures were enforced, ports were dredged, canals were maintained, and new settlements were planted where trade could flourish. The message to subjects was that the dynasty guaranteed the everyday workings of life, and in exchange it expected taxes and loyalty. Many people accepted because order felt profitable. The peaks of these kingdoms appeared in bustling cities and irrigated fields that kept famine at bay. Scholarship and commerce produced glow that reached beyond borders. Law anchored contracts, and courts judged disputes that might otherwise have become blood feuds. The result was an empire of routines that citizens could rely on, and routine is the most underrated luxury an empire can offer. Decline arrived through a mix of overextension, dynastic quarrels, and the slow rise of outside competitors who learned to fight smarter. When the treasury was stretched, rulers sold future revenue to tax farmers for quick cash and lost public trust when collection turned harsh. When brothers fought, armies split. When rivals encroached, border garrisons cost more than fields could pay. The arithmetic stopped working smoothly. The successor lesson is that good administration can keep a complex realm running for generations. Yet good administration must be defended by clear succession and sensible frontiers. When rulers mortgage tomorrow's taxes to survive today's crisis, they invite a future they will not enjoy. Systems age when shortcuts replace standards, and that aging becomes visible at the edges first. 200 BC Carthaginian Empire. Carthage built a sea-focused empire whose strength was contracts and harbors. Merchants and admirals worked in partnership. Strategic islands and fortified ports formed a chain that turned the western Mediterranean into a revenue basin. Profits funded mercenary armies because citizens were needed at home to keep commerce humming. This model favored flexibility at sea and clever bargaining on land. The rise of Carthage demonstrated how trade can project power without large populations. Control of choke points allowed tariffs to flow into the treasury and discouraged rivals from contesting waters that felt governed. Silver mines and agricultural estates in overseas territories added layers of income. A council of experienced families oversaw policy with a view to cost and return, which kept risk within bounds for many years. At its height, Carthage was a broker of wealth and influence. Allies received protection for their own commerce, and shared ventures spread risk in ways land powers did not easily copy. The city's shipyards produced and repaired fleets with assembly line speed, and this capacity discouraged sudden challenges because challengers knew they faced a navy that reappeared after losses. Predictability is strength when the battlefield is ocean. The fall came when a rival with deep manpower and an emerging bureaucratic army refused to accept Carthaginian dominance. Land campaigns stretched the mercenary model to its breaking point because loyalty based on pay is brittle during reversals. Political divisions at home complicated strategy. When final defeat arrived, it revealed a key weakness. A maritime empire must still survive a land war if the opponent drags it ashore. Carthage leaves a lesson about specialization. Mastery of trade and sea power can build a robust realm, but a balanced defense must exist for the day a rival drags the fight into terrain the maritime power least prefers. Diversified strength preserves choice. Too narrow a focus invites a trap that a determined adversary will eventually set. 100 AD Roman Empire. Rome rose through a ladder of alliances that turned neighbors into partners and partners into subjects who felt valued. Citizen soldiers fought for land and status, while roads and colonies held gains in place. Law followed the legions and taught communities how to operate inside the Roman frame. The promise was simple: serve and be rewarded, resist and face relentless pressure that most could not endure for long. As the realm expanded, the state professionalized its forces and standardized its administration. Granaries linked to shipping lanes fed cities and garrisons. Tax schedules became routine. Local elites joined the imperial story by seeking office and patronage within the Roman system. Latin spread because it was useful. The empire felt less like a conqueror and more like a club that ambitious people wanted to join. Peak Rome balanced soldierly grit with a civic promise that citizenship could widen. The city became the empire in law, even when the empire was many cities in practice. Roads allowed messages to arrive on schedule. Courts offered resolutions that replaced private vengeance. The coinage spoke a language of stability that merchants trusted. Peace came not from the absence of force, but from its predictable presence. Strain built when frontier defense demanded more men and more money than the tax base could easily supply. Civil wars over succession drained reserves and trained armies to follow individual commanders rather than the office they held. External pressures from migrating groups compounded internal disarray. A realm that once exported stability began to import instability, and that reversal was hard to stop. Rome's enduring lesson is twofold. Institutions can buy time on a scale unmatched by charisma alone, and inclusion can turn outsiders into defenders. Yet even the best institutions must be renewed with care during transitions. When the army becomes the elector, policy bends toward the camps, and when the treasury cannot meet promises, loyalty frays. The law remains a gift to later ages, even when the empire that wrote it fades. 530 AD Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman state survived by becoming expert at patience and payment. It valued intelligence and negotiation as much as arms. Gold bought time. Marriage sealed agreements that would have required many campaigns to enforce. Skilled administrators collected taxes with enough fairness to avoid revolt, and with enough firmness to pay troops who guarded a frontier that shifted with every generation. The rise of Byzantium as a distinct power came from geography and governance. A capital that straddled sea lanes could move fleets and control trade. A bureaucracy that valued records could adjust after shocks. Legal compilations gave clarity to courts, and clarity is the friend of peace because it lets merchants plan and families settle disputes without violence. Culture added prestige that turned the capital into a beacon. Peak strength arrived when diplomacy, law, and technology intersected. Defensive innovations at sea and in city walls created margins of safety. Envoys learned languages and mapped factional landscapes in neighboring courts, then exploited those maps. Paying one tribe to check another cost less than moving legions, and a treasury that understood this arithmetic stayed solvent longer than rivals expected. Decline came in waves. Religious and political fights sapped unity. Rivals learned new tactics and acquired new weapons. A single disaster could be survived, but sequenced disasters strained the reserve of gold, goodwill, and garrisons. When allies became opportunists, the capital discovered that prestige cannot replace lost fleets. Shock multiplied because previous strength had masked vulnerabilities, and enemies waited for masks to slip. The Byzantine lesson is that brains and wallets can outlast many storms, yet even the cleverest strategy needs replenishment. Paying for peace works as long as the market rate remains affordable. When prices rise or income falls, the same policy becomes a trap. A state that survives for many centuries proves the power of adaptation, while warning that adaptation must never become complacency. 247 BC Parthian and Sasanian Persia. Parthian power rose from a frontier that outsiders misread. Mounted archers who could feign retreat and then wheel to shoot at a distance turned set-piece battles into chases that drained heavy infantry. Cataphracts added a wall of iron that shattered tired lines. This blend of mobility and shock created space for a new state to grow between older powers and to tax the trade that crossed deserts and mountains. The surprise was not only martial but administrative restraint that trusted local nobles to manage their own people as long as tribute arrived. The Parthian court learned to rule as a broker rather than a micromanager. Kings balanced clans and granted autonomy in exchange for loyalty on campaign. Caravans moved because merchants believed the routes would stay safe and because way stations refreshed men and animals. Coins carried familiar images that encouraged trust across many tongues. The state did not need to rewrite every village rulebook to profit from long-distance exchange. It only needed to guarantee that contracts would be honored and brigands punished. Peak strength appeared in repeated stalemates with Rome that left eastern provinces of their rival wary of rash adventures. Victory did not require conquering the Mediterranean. It required protecting the profitable corridor that linked the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Border cities became markets and bargaining tables rather than simple fortresses. The empire's greatest weapon was the refusal to be drawn into battles that favored the enemy. Staying solvent meant staying patient. Sasanian rulers reshaped this template with a sharper central spine. A new dynasty embraced a more formal bureaucracy, clearer tax codes, and a religious establishment that framed kingship as sacred duty. Heavy cavalry remained the striking arm, yet the roads, canals, and frontier fortifications show a state that invested in everyday order. Diplomacy, war, and ceremony worked together to sustain a rivalry with Rome and later with Byzantium for centuries, a testament to administrative stamina as much as valor. Final decline came when long wars with Byzantium drained reserves and when a swift new force from Arabia struck a tired realm. A state that had calibrated balance for generations suddenly faced a tempo it could not match. The decisive truth is simple. A broker empire thrives when it controls the price of peace along key routes, and it fails when war becomes too constant to price. 322 BC Mauryan and Gupta India. Mauryan rise began with a coalition of talent and will. Chandragupta built a court that made information a weapon and logistics a habit. Officials counted fields and animals, roads and ferries, and turned those counts into revenue that could be forecast rather than guessed. Garrisons held junctions, and the capital became a magnet for craftsmen and scholars who enjoyed the stability that new institutions promised. The question was never only how to win ground. It was how to keep it predictable. Ashoka changed the empire's tone without breaking its frame. After brutal conquest, he chose to publish edicts that taught a civic ethic of restraint and care. Roads gained shade trees and wells, courts were urged to avoid hasty punishments, governors were reminded that justice persuades where cruelty merely quiets. This moral turn did not empty the treasury. It widened the circle of consent and made the imperial brand more trustworthy to distant communities. Mauryan peak came when this machinery delivered calm across a patchwork of languages and faiths. Trade moved from the Deccan to the Ganges Valley with fewer tolls and fewer surprises. Armies remained ready, yet were not always needed because predictability discouraged rebellion. The feeling that tomorrow would be much like today meant farmers planted with confidence and merchants invested with longer horizons. That is the quiet signature of a strong empire. Decline followed a familiar slope. Succession loosened the center's grip. Provincial elites discovered new leverage. The court could not be everywhere, and a realm built for breadth struggled when local magnates pulled harder than the capital. When the cost of coordinating thousands of villages rose faster than tax collection, the arithmetic of empire wobbled. The same roads that once carried orders now carried news of opportunities to disobey. Many centuries later, the Gupta dynasty revived a lighter imperial idea built on culture and commerce. Sanskrit literature blossomed, metalwork and astronomy impressed observers, and the tax state rested more on cooperation than on compulsion. Pressure from steppe raiders and rival polities eventually cracked that grace. The memory that remains is compelling. Soft power can lift an empire when hard power is modest, but even golden ages need guards. 221 BC, Qin and Han China. Qin unification began with an obsession for standards. Measures, axles, scripts, and laws were brought into line so that carts would fit the roads and contracts would not be questioned in the next valley. Forts flattened local resistance, and canals turned geography into a servant rather than a master. The method was severe, and it aimed to make order inevitable. Results arrived quickly because speed follows simplicity in administration. Severity proved brittle. The first generation after unification faced revolt because people resented the grind of forced labor and collective punishments, even if those measures had created the very roads and walls that made the state formidable. A successor house learned from the backlash. Han rulers kept the skeleton of standardization but covered it with a Confucian skin that praised virtue, filial duty, and humane governance. A hard toolset wore a softer face, and citizens noticed the difference. Han Peak grew from an elegant mixture. Bureaucrats trained for exams handled routine cases. Frontier commanders bargained with steppe leaders and opened trade that enriched the core. Salt and iron monopolies paid for defense, while debates in the court asked whether state power should be heavy or light. The imperial center did not always agree with itself, yet it learned to hear its own doubts, which slowed mistakes and extended longevity. Strain arrived in cycles. Court factions fought for influence. Landlords accumulated estates that slipped from tax rolls. Peasant movements erupted when harvests failed and when justice felt too far away. Emergency commanders gained personal followings that outgrew the offices that created them. The last decades felt like a tug of war between institutions and improvisers, and the improvisers finally pulled the rope their way. China carried the deeper lesson forward. Centralization is a powerful drug that cures fragmentation but can overdose the patient. States that last learn to breathe between firmness and mercy and to share status widely enough that talent sees a future inside the system. When that balance holds, a bureaucracy turns from a cage into a ladder. 618 AD Tang China. Tang rulers blended steppe vigor with courtly refinement to build a realm that dazzled visitors. Cavalry traditions from the frontier gave the early armies reach, while a restored civil service gave the capital brains. The equal field system promised predictable land allotments to stabilize rural life. This was a state that believed prosperity should be planned rather than left to luck. People noticed because predictability is persuasive. Cosmopolitan cities made the empire feel porous in the best way. Traders from far places found officials who could process papers and settle disputes. Poets and painters found patrons who prized excellence as a public good. The capital projected confidence through ceremony and through fair dealing with merchants who could have sailed or ridden elsewhere. That confidence kept tax receipts flowing and quieted borderlands that might have flirted with revolt. The high tide also brought oversight. Examinations opened routes to office that did not depend only on birth. Codes set guidelines for penalties and rewards. These rules did not erase favoritism, but they narrowed it. A province could hope that an honest petition would be read and answered, and that hope is a powerful glue for large polities. The wider the hope, the longer the calm. The An Lushan Rising tore a hole in that fabric. A general with vast delegated authority turned his mandate into a bid for the throne. The empire survived the shock, but the repair work never fully restored the earlier balance. To pay for defense, tax changes reduced the equal field structure and raised the burden on commerce. Regional commanders kept the powers they had gathered during the crisis. The center regained control, yet not the easy confidence of the earlier decades. Tang memory is both proud and cautionary. The age showed how a state can cultivate culture and growth while maintaining military reach. It also showed that success generates specialists who demand autonomy. When the cost of keeping specialists loyal rises, the budget of trust shrinks. A dynasty that had seemed immortal learned how quickly a single fracture can widen. 661 AD, Islamic Caliphates Umayyad and Abbasid. Early expansion raced along routes that pastoral fighters understood. Light cavalry crossed dry lands where heavier armies withered, and a clear religious message bound tribes into a larger project. Cities that opened their gates often kept local administrators and judges, which minimized disruption. The new rulers changed coinage and tax terms but did not insist on sameness. That restraint lowered the price of conquest and made acceptance more likely. Umayyad leaders pushed across North Africa into Iberia and far into Central Asia while consolidating rule through a new center and new symbols of state. Arabic became the language of administration, and coins carried messages of unity that everyone could read. The caliphate built a sense of order that reached beyond battlefields. People paid because the courts worked and because the tax farmer had limits. The promise was not only spiritual, it was practical and visible. The Abbasid revolution shifted gravity to a river world of learning and trade. Baghdad drew scholars who translated works from many civilizations, and that translation effort nourished medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. The court invested in canals that fed cities and in markets that made strangers into partners. A refined bureaucracy kept records and trained talent. For a time, the blend of faith, knowledge, and finance made the state seem unassailable and admired. Vastness, however, breeds intermediaries. Provincial dynasties gained confidence. Military households recruited men whose first loyalty was to patrons rather than to the caliph. Revenue slipped as local rulers withheld remittances to fund their own projects. The center still shone, but the rays did not burn as far. When a great shock struck the capital, the aura dimmed, and the network that had relied on that glow learned to live without the lamp. The story leaves a clear imprint. Rapid growth can be guided into durable order when law and tolerance keep the peace inexpensive. Yet the longer a network stretches, the more gatekeepers it creates, and those gatekeepers eventually negotiate for themselves. A realm built on a shared book and a shared budget flourishes when both remain persuasive. 1206 AD, Mongol Empire. A new confederation on the steppe began with the simple act of enforcing loyalty across clan lines. Rewards flowed to those who delivered, and punishments fell on those who betrayed. Merit, speed, and discipline became the code. Units were counted in tens and hundreds and thousands, which made command clear and logistics calculable. Relay stations gave fresh mounts, and scouts mapped land with the care of surveyors. The army moved like a weather front that opponents could not read until it was upon them. The surprise for the settled world was administrative, not only military. Local officials were kept if they proved useful. Artisans were spared and resettled to places where their skills multiplied value. Religious communities were granted safety so long as they paid taxes and kept order. Merchants received escort papers that turned perilous roads into safe corridors. The invaders acted as builders of a new security regime that reached from sea to sea. At its peak, the empire became a continental insurance policy. Caravans could cross from one sea to another with a reasonable expectation of arriving on time. Cities along the routes grew confident enough to invest in warehouses and bridges. Knowledge flowed because the same protection that sheltered goods also sheltered ideas. The sum felt larger than the parts, which is the signature of a genuine imperial order. Stress emerged the moment succession moved from one extraordinary figure to the next. The same kinship politics that had enabled unity under pressure returned once the pressure slackened. Great domains drifted towards separate priorities. Distance amplified differences in interest and temperament. The network did not vanish, but its master switch no longer existed. A map that had looked like one realm became a family of related powers with their own clocks. The Mongol experience proves that speed can conquer and that rules can hold the winnings, but that a single architecture cannot easily sustain command from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. When the cost of gathering a council exceeds the benefits of one voice, a chorus takes over. The song remains recognizable even when the lead singer leaves the stage. 1299 AD, Ottoman Empire. A small frontier principality learned how to turn a border zone into a launch pad. Warriors drawn by faith and prize and opportunity flowed into a banner that promised steady expansion and fair shares. Land grants to cavalry households rewarded service without emptying the treasury. Market towns along migration routes became staging grounds where grain and timber and iron could be assembled quickly. The realm grew like a braid, with each strand strengthening the others. City after city entered not only by siege but by negotiation. Local notables who accepted the new order kept status and gained access to a larger marketplace. Christian and Jewish communities were organized into recognized bodies that managed their own schools and courts while sending taxes upward. This autonomy reduced friction and made the capital more informed about its subjects. A ruler who knows what people will accept spends less on force and less on guesswork. Peak power arrived when sea lanes and land routes both answered to the same coordination. Artillery units learned to break walls that older armies treated as invincible. A new legal synthesis balanced religious norms with sultanic decrees so that judges and officials shared a workflow. The army that guarded this ensemble was salaried and drilled, which meant the center could project predictable power rather than ad hoc raids. Predictable power calms fear and invites investment. The long middle years required adaptation. Rivals acquired similar weapons. Fiscal pressures rose as gun units and fleets demanded regular pay. Interest groups within the capital defended their privileges, and reformers wrestled with them. Some decades favored experimentation, and some decades retreated into caution. The empire survived those swings because its base still reached from market to village and because it knew how to bargain with both. The unraveling gathered when external shocks and internal national movements aligned. Provinces that had long accepted imperial identity began to imagine their own flags. European states pressed with industrial strength and new ideas of sovereignty. The treasury found that yesterday's revenue no longer covered today's bills. When the final reckoning came, the old machine could not be rebuilt quickly enough. A state that had organized 3 continents left behind laws and buildings and habits that outlived the banners. 1368 AD, Ming and Qing China. Ming founders rebuilt a devastated land by restoring fields, registering households, and punishing predation. Early rulers limited court factions by setting strict codes and by moving the capital's weight carefully. Tribute missions and controlled trade kept contacts with neighbors, while vast internal projects dug canals and planted trees. Stability became a public performance that farmers and merchants could watch with relief. When the crops returned, confidence returned with them. Exploration reached wide seas under commanders who treated the ocean as a stage for state prestige and commerce. Those voyages ended, yet coastal trade continued through licensed ports, and silver from far across the world began to pour into markets that increasingly preferred coin to grain levies. Craftsmen organized productive districts that filled cities with porcelain and silk and lacquer. Revenue rose on the tides of exchange and specialization that the state tried to guide. Late Ming strains grew from court quarrels, rising military costs on multiple fronts, and sudden fiscal shocks when silver supplies faltered. Rural unrest spiked when tax collection turned erratic. Commanders who were meant to pacify rebels built their own followings. A northern neighbor who had learned Chinese institutions and who commanded fierce cavalry pressed into the vacuum of trust and took the mandate. The transfer did not erase the administrative memory of the land. It redirected it. Qing rulers stitched a multi-ethnic empire with banners, compromise, and pragmatic respect for local elites. Expansion secured the northwest and integrated borderlands with garrisons and negotiated autonomy. High Qing prosperity made granaries full and literature abundant. Jesuit advisors mapped the skies, while local scholars mapped the past. The house seemed immovable because everything important seemed regular. Then the 19th century arrived with steam, opium, unequal treaties, and internal movements that declared new loyalties. The court struggled to fund modern arsenals and to reform examinations while fighting fires on many fronts. Each emergency consumed the resources needed to prevent the next. When the old weave finally loosened, a republic claimed the loom. The enduring truth is that a great bureaucracy can feed millions and hold mountains, yet it must renew its purpose as the world changes or watch its own rules turn into ropes. 1235 AD Mali and Songhai. Mali began with a founder who convinced fractured clans that unity would make their children safer and their caravans richer. River valleys and savanna roads became predictable again, which is the first measure of statehood. Gold fields under firm hands funded gifts that traveled to distant courts, and the reputation of order drew scholars and traders to market towns where a stranger could find a judge who listened. The echo of that promise still carries. Wealth turned into influence when a famous pilgrimage announced to the wider world that a new power thrived in the Western Sahel. Mosques and schools multiplied because knowledge blesses trade with trust. Caravans had less to fear from thieves and more to gain from contracts. Local chiefs found that the capital respected their customs as long as the tolls were paid and the roads were kept open. That bargain kept quarrels from becoming wars across wide distances. Long-distance exchange depends on wider winds. When the balance of commerce tilted toward Atlantic coasts and when local rivals gained confidence, the old corridors lost some of their traffic. Conflicts within the realm made recovery slower. The empire did not vanish overnight. It discovered that a web built for one set of routes was harder to adapt to new ones that opened with changing demand. Songhai stepped into the opening with a river navy, cavalry columns, and a ruler who stabilized the bureaucracy. Auditors checked provincial accounts. Judges applied a blend of local practice and Islamic law that made communities feel heard. Scholars taught in Timbuktu and Gao, while merchants stacked salt and grain in protected depots. A second golden moment rested on the same principle as the first. Security grows wealth, and wealth grows schools. An army from the north armed with early firearms brought the cycle to an abrupt turn. The invader did not need to conquer every village to break the state. It only needed to shatter the core that coordinated the rest. The lesson is clean. Sahelian empires prosper when they keep the river safe, the desert guides honest, and the books balanced. They falter when routes shift faster than institutions can adapt to the new flow. 1428 AD, Aztec and Inca. Aztec power rose from a pact among cities that turned tribute into military fuel. Chinampa fields near the capital produced astonishing harvests that fed warriors and craftsmen, while a strict social order directed labor where it was needed most. Conquered towns retained their own gods and councils, but sent goods and captives as proof of submission. The center performed grandeur that persuaded allies and frightened doubters. The feeling of inevitability can be a more potent weapon than any spear on the field. Inca rule took shape in a different landscape, with a similar talent for organization. Terraced slopes harvested water and sunlight with careful patience. Storehouses placed a day's march apart fed messengers and soldiers. A road network tied valley to valley with such precision that a message could cross mountains faster than a stranger could comprehend. Communities were integrated through a labor tax that traded days of work for the empire's guarantee of food in lean times. Both systems converted geography into advantage. Lakes and canals made gardens near the Aztec capital yield like no other fields. Andes and Altiplano made the Inca capital hard to threaten and easy to supply. Administration in each case learned local languages and rhythms so that orders sounded familiar. People complied because the benefits of order were visible in temples and markets and warehouses. Compliance turned large realms into daily routines that felt normal. Internal strains grew from success. Tribute demands tempted corruption. Regional lords weighed their allegiance when the center showed weakness. A war between claimants or a drought that disturbed planting could change the risk calculations of many towns at once. When foreign ships appeared with steel and new diseases, the cost of doubt rose sharply. Alliances shifted because yesterday's fears no longer matched today's threats on the ground. The fall of each empire was not a simple fate. It was delivered by a meeting of vulnerabilities and timing. Rival indigenous allies, unfamiliar pathogens, and tactical shocks broke confidence as much as walls. Yet the administrative genius that built these realms deserves the final word. Where organization is strong, a people can turn lakes and mountains into engines of plenty. Where that organization falters, even a great city can suddenly find itself alone. 1540 AD Spanish Empire. Castile and Aragon discovered that oceans could be turned into roads, and those roads flowed to a treasury that counted silver in staggering amounts. The conquest of wealthy American realms opened mines that worked with relentless rhythm, and fleets carried bullion along guarded routes to Iberian ports. That stream of metal financed soldiers in Europe, paid creditors, and funded courts that proclaimed a universal Catholic monarchy. The engine of Spanish power was not only courage at sea, it was the discipline of convoys, the vigilance of inspectors, and the arithmetic of a crown that learned to think on a global scale. The Habsburg network tied Iberia to Central Europe through marriage and inheritance, which turned Spanish strength into a continental balance game. Governors in Naples and Milan, viceroys in Mexico and Peru, and deputies across the islands of the Atlantic managed a wide set of priorities under one royal seal. Law codes and councils tried to make distant territories legible to Madrid, while missionaries and scholars wrote dictionaries of American languages that made rule less blind. The surprising fact is that cultural translation became a tool of administration as real as a regiment. Spain at its height secured sea lanes with flotas that sailed in season and under escort, and it seeded fortified ports at critical points. Manila linked Asia to the New World through the galleon trade, bringing silk and porcelain to Acapulco and then to Seville. The price revolution that followed the silver flood raised costs across Europe and reshaped markets from Antwerp to Istanbul. Spanish policymakers could not control those ripples completely, yet they understood that steady movement of treasure kept alliances intact and armies in the field. Stress grew in places where bullion masked structural weakness. Heavy reliance on imported silver made the crown vulnerable to disruptions at sea and to the bargaining power of bankers who advanced cash against future shipments. Repeated wars on multiple fronts demanded money after bad seasons and after damaged fleets. The state often sold offices and future tax receipts to raise funds quickly, and those sales eroded trust in the fairness of the fiscal system. A realm that could reach across oceans struggled to reform habits at home. The long decline came through a series of adjustments rather than a single catastrophe. Dutch and English rivals learned to fight on water with equal skill, while local elites in the Americas matured into communities with their own ambitions. Spain retained great holdings for centuries, yet the center of gravity shifted as creditors, competitors, and colonial subjects pressed in different directions at once. What remains is the lesson that global wealth must be matched by domestic resilience, or the crown will discover that abundance can be a trap. 1610 AD, Portuguese and Dutch maritime empires. Portugal pioneered the oceanic template by pushing along Africa, mastering winds, and building a string of forts that turned voyages into predictable circuits. Caravels explored, carracks hauled, and royal agents learned the language of spices, slaves, and sugar in markets that had their own rules before Europeans arrived. The Estado de India did not conquer whole continents. It controlled nodes where customs were collected and where naval guns could persuade merchants to respect Portuguese passes. This nodal strategy let a small kingdom play a large game. Sugar plantations on Atlantic islands and in Brazil showed how a crop could reshape labor, land, and law. Mills demanded constant capital, and harbors adapted to a new rhythm of export. The wealth was real and the human cost was profound, and it is important to remember that commerce built on coerced labor leaves institutions that can distort a region long after the first profits fade. Portuguese officials mixed piety with pragmatism, building churches beside warehouses, and that pairing gave the empire a distinct flavor on both sides of the ocean. The Dutch learned from every Portuguese innovation and then scaled the system with joint stock finance that spread risk among many investors. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie could raise funds invisibly compared to royal treasuries, and the Amsterdam Exchange turned voyages into tradable expectations. Dutch fleets moved with purpose, factories sat at critical straits, and naval power defended the toll booths of a world economy that was being rewired. It is striking that a city on a shallow bay could momentarily direct the flow of Asian goods to Europe. Peak Dutch strength relied on information and contracts as much as on cannon. Merchants kept price lists with a precision that allowed managers to redirect ships mid-voyage, and clerks cataloged cargo with a clarity that courts could enforce. The company minted coin, made treaties, and at times waged war, which blurred the line between firm and state. That blur worked while dividends soothed shareholders and while rivals remained divided, but it created vulnerabilities when wars dragged on and when prices turned. Portuguese and Dutch decline did not mean disappearance. It meant adaptation under pressure. Portugal ceded many eastern positions while building a deep American world. The Dutch lost monopolies when English and French navies learned to fight better and borrow more. Yet the central insight they shared survived. In an oceanic age, power comes from the control of choke points, the crafting of credible paper, and the coordination of fleets that follow the calendar more faithfully than flags. 1763 AD French Colonial Empire. France expanded overseas with a model that mixed royal direction, missionary zeal, and settlers who carved farms beside rivers and forests. In North America, a chain of forts and alliances with indigenous nations stretched from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi, designed less to flood the land with people and more to control movement and exchange. In the Caribbean, sugar islands produced fortunes that financed grand houses and new debates in Paris about the nature of wealth and citizenship. A continental great power was learning the grammar of empire at sea. Administration in the colonies toggled between two ideas. One was assimilation, the notion that subjects might be made French in language and law through schools and codes. The other was association, the notion that local institutions would be preserved under French protection in exchange for resources and respect. Officials experimented across West Africa and Indochina with different mixtures, and the record shows successes and resentments in almost equal degree. A state that prided itself on universal values struggled with the particulars of distance. France reached a high point of prestige when its science, fashion, and philosophy lured elites from Madrid to Moscow, and when its armies under remarkable commanders seemed to dictate terms on land. Yet imperial arithmetic is unforgiving when naval weakness exposes overseas assets. Losses in the 7 Years' War warned that without maritime strength and sustained credit, colonies could not be defended. Later, the Age of Revolutions forced France to rethink empire entirely, as ideas of citizenship and rights leapt across oceans with dangerous energy. The 19th century rebuilt a different colonial map focused on Africa and Asia, with railways, schools, and code books that aimed to make governance more systematic. Paris promised development and order, while critics pointed to extraction and inequality. Administrators who learned local languages could mitigate abuses, yet the structural imbalance between metropole and colony persisted. Insurgencies and reforms arrived in cycles that taxed the patience of both rulers and ruled. France's decolonization after the Second World War unfolded through negotiation, conflict, and finally a hard turn toward a new role in a world of independent nations. The lesson is precise. A powerful culture and a skilled bureaucracy can project influence far from home, but without an unbeatable fleet and deep financial reserves, a crown will be forced one day to trade authority for partnership. The shape of that trade determines the memory of the empire. 1890 AD British Empire. Britain assembled the most extensive empire in history by marrying sea power to finance and by aligning private enterprise with public policy. The Royal Navy secured trade routes, insurers priced risk, and the gold-based credit system funneled capital to projects that stitched together distant markets. Steamships, telegraph cables, and standardized time turned the world into a coordinated schedule that favored firms and officials under the Union Jack. The brilliance of this system was that it often ruled by contract before it ruled by conquest. In India, a company began as a trader and became a sovereign that minted coin, commanded armies, and collected taxes. After a major rebellion, the crown took direct control and tried to govern through law codes, census, and railways that bound the subcontinent into a single administrative frame. The promise was order and development. The debate was over who benefited and who paid the heaviest costs. Schools and courts produced new elites who would later speak for independence with the language that the empire had taught them. Britain at its apogee balanced a home island with coal and iron against a global archipelago of ports and colonies. Egypt was held to guard the route to India, southern Africa to secure minerals and shipping lanes, and island stations to refuel steamers that kept time with the Greenwich clock. Free trade was preached as a universal good, and in many years it delivered cheap food and manufactured goods in unprecedented quantities. Prestige flowed from a sense that the system worked for everyone, even when the accounts showed unequal shares. 2 world wars smashed the arithmetic that had made the empire easy to finance. Debt climbed, ships sank, and the moral authority to rule without consent drained away as colonized peoples demanded the right to write their own laws. Britain adapted again, this time by helping create institutions that would sustain a global economy without formal empire. The Commonwealth and a web of commercial ties replaced direct rule, and the pivot was one of the most significant strategic reinventions in modern history. The British story proves that logistics and law can govern continents at low daily cost, but that crises can suddenly convert low cost into impossible expense. The institutions left behind are as important as the territories once colored on maps. Where courts remained fair and civil services stayed professional, the legacy bent towards stability. Where that did not happen, the end of empire opened long arguments that continue into the present. 1917 AD Russian Empire to Soviet superpower. Russia expanded across forests, steppes, and Siberian rivers with a patient push that planted forts at river bends and towns at crossroads, absorbing diverse peoples under a czar who promised protection and order. Fur, grain, and later oil and minerals supplied a treasury that alternated between bursts of reform and periods of repression. The empire's strength was depth and climate, the ability to trade space for time against invaders, and a culture of endurance that impressed friends and frightened enemies. The weakness was a brittle politics that struggled to share power. When revolution overturned the imperial house, a new order rose that centralized industry, mobilized peasants into workers, and accelerated heavy manufacturing with plans that measured output to the last bolt. The early decades were harsh and breakneck, yet the industrial base built in those years later proved decisive when the country faced the most dangerous invasion in its history. The Second World War scarred the land and forged a superpower that would shape world affairs for generations. The Soviet system reached a kind of peak when it combined nuclear deterrence with space triumphs, and when it organized client states through aid, advisors, and ideology. Railways and pipelines carried the products of a continent, and education produced engineers in vast numbers. The model delivered stability and security at great cost in freedom and consumer comfort, and the leadership believed that the trade was worth it. For a time, the balance held because order felt safer than change. The long decline began when growth slowed and innovation lagged behind rivals. Central planning struggled to reward creativity, and the engines that once roared began to cough. Wars on the periphery drained resources and trust, while an arms race consumed budgets that were needed for housing and food. Attempts to reform from the top loosened old bindings without building new supports, and republics within the Union asserted their own paths. The final break came with an economic and political crisis that the state could not manage, and the Union dissolved into sovereign nations that inherited pieces of a vast military, industrial, and cultural complex. The enduring insight from this arc is that immense land empires can survive shocks that would end smaller states, yet they must find a way to combine discipline with adaptation, or the center will lose the consent of its own periphery. The map changed, but the scale of the inheritance ensures that the story will remain central to the modern era. Conclusion: the echo and the checklist. Empires rise when they find energy they can organize, whether it is river grain, ocean wind, mountain silver, or a coal seam under rain. The first task is always the same: turn resources into habits that bind people to schedules that deliver safety and status. When that happens, distant towns start to think of the capital as a partner rather than a predator, and that quiet shift matters more than a parade. A realm becomes an empire when consent lowers the cost of command. Peaks belong to systems that keep promises on time. Soldiers are paid regularly. Courts answer predictably. Roads are maintained without drama. The feeling of inevitability thickens as tax receipts arrive like the seasons, and as competing elites discover their futures are brighter inside the imperial tent. That thickness is the shield that turns raids into annoyances and disputes into paperwork. The highest form of imperial power is not fear, it is routine. Falls arrive by many roads, yet they converge on a few truths. Succession uncertainty invites factions to gamble, and gamblers rarely retire in peace. Peripheral provinces that once paid for protection begin to cost more than they return. Shock events such as droughts, plagues, or price collapses expose thin reserves and brittle policies. When the story of rule no longer rings true, even a road network that once carried pride begins to carry doubt. Collapse is a loss of confidence before it is a loss of forts. The lessons from Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, China, the Caliphates, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the modern oceanic empires point to a simple checklist. Keep logistics sacred. Share status widely enough that talent believes in the center. Guard the budget like a fortress. Decide succession before rivals do it for you. Update the story of rule so that new generations hear themselves in it. Where that checklist is honored, empires endure beyond any one ruler. Where it is ignored, the end is a question of when rather than whether. All that remains after the borders recede are the institutions and habits people carry forward. Roads become trade routes for new states. Laws become the foundation of future courts. Languages become bridges for new conversations. Even when empires fall, they leave behind tools others will use. That is why the study of rise and fall is more than a tour of triumphs and tragedies. It is a guide for the builders of tomorrow who will face the same old problems with their own new names. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more ominous history videos. See you next time.